Hi, Abby.
Hi, thank you all so much for having us.
Lovely to see you again. I think I saw you last in the UK.
Yes, indeed.
Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to this our 12th installment of the NITAGs Support Hub based here in Cape Town in collaboration with WHO of in tackling various issues in the vaccination and immunization space. And today's webinar, which is on advancing vaccines and immunization practices through modeling, will be an exciting one, just like the other previous ones have been before. My name is Ruzani. I'm based here at the University of Cape Town, and I work with a team that is at NICH, which is based at the Faculty of Health Sciences here, University of Cape Town. Just to make you aware that this current one today is being hosted as usual in collaboration with WHO, but in particular involving the Immunization and Vaccine-Related Implementation Research Advisory Committee, the IVIRAC. And as before, our main reason for doing this is to share with NITAGs and other stakeholders within the immunization space the utility of modeling to support vaccine decision-making in Africa. We're going to discuss how modeling has aided, specifically in this context, rubella vaccination, and also to orient on the rationale for modeling new TB vaccines introduction and highlight the ongoing modeling initiative to support vaccines and immunization decisions. And I just want to specifically welcome and acknowledge members of the Vaccine Impact Modeling Consortium, who both the Afro-RITEC as well as our NITAG Support Hub are important stakeholders in the work that they're doing. And we really appreciate all these efforts that have really started making a big difference in terms of how we see the immunization space, in particular, where there is minimum data and we don't have ways of predicting, what responses should be and where they're in place, what their potential impact ought to be. So thank you very much for this, and thank you for making the time. And some of the people who are speaking here have barely woken up based on where they are in the world. They are trying to drink their second cup of coffee to just keep themselves awake. And thank you very much for that. So the first speaker is going to be Balcha Gema Masresha, who is a public health researcher, vaccinologist, and who is based at WHO. And we just thought it's quite important to have kind of, facts on the ground before we talk about modeling. Who'll just update us on rubella elimination progress within the African continent. Just to note two things that the niche team will kill me for not reminding you is that you would have noted when you log in a poll with two questions. Would you please just take some time to respond to that? And again, just for those who cannot hear me, just to note that we do have an AI-based interpretation service. So you should be able to to hear all presentations in French and Portuguese, but because this is an ongoing trial on our part, we really appreciate you just giving us a feedback on how it is working and if there's anything we need to do to tweak it. But after you, there will be Emmy Winter and Matt Ferrari from the VIMC, and who will then talk about the modeling part, and then we'll have a short question and answer session, and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much, Bacha. You can share your screen and take it from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Udzani. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, can you please just confirm that you can see my screen?
We can see it, but yeah, thank you. We can see it and it's now in presenter mode. You can continue. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. So my name is Balcha Girma Masresha. I work with the WHO Regional Office for Africa, and I coordinate the measles and rubella elimination work in the WHO African region, which consists of 47 countries, more or less the whole of sub-Saharan African countries. And I'll just walk you through a few slides to try and summarize where we are with regards to rubella elimination in the region. I'll just remind you about the regional goal and go through some of the strategies and point towards the way forward and where we think we'll be investing our energies in the coming years. So with regards to the goal, basically the Africa region started working on measles control around 2001 and has more and more been incorporating rubella control work when more and more countries were supported with MR vaccination. And since 2021, we have revised our goal to include rubella elimination by 2030 in at least 80% of the countries in the region. And to get there, we need high-level coverage with the first and the second dose of measles and rubella containing vaccine. We need very high coverage during periodic mass vaccination campaigns. And through high population immunity, we intend to bring the incidence of measles and the incidence of rubella down to less than 1 case per million on the background of high quality disease surveillance. So I'll try to go through the implementation, basically summarizing where we are with this. This slide summarizes the number of countries that have introduced the second dose of measles vaccine nationwide as of the end of last year. And then on the right-hand side, the number of countries that have introduced rubella-containing vaccine. So for MCV2, second dose of measles-containing vaccine, it could be measles or MR or MMR in a few instances. We have only 3 countries remaining, whereas rubella vaccine introduction, we still have some distance to go. The countries that you see in the white colors, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Madagascar, Chad, and Guinea, and so on, have not yet introduced rubella vaccine and are not, do not have any approvals for rubella vaccine introduction or any financing yet. But at least Nigeria and DRC have received approval from Gavi and funding from Gavi to introduce rubella vaccine starting the end of this year. These are big countries and they normally do their introduction in wide age range mass vaccination campaigns followed by routine introduction. So it will be a phased introduction starting this year and ending in 2026. With regards to coverage, currently this is where we are. The first dose vaccination coverage is at 70%. This is for all measles containing vaccines, whereas the first dose rubella containing vaccine coverage at regional level is at 36%. And this is because not every country has a rubella containing vaccine in their system, as I just showed you. For the second dose measles containing vaccine, which is the line in orange, currently we are at 49%. So probably the main point here is that eventually when every country has introduced rubella containing vaccine, the RCV1 and MCV1 coverage will definitely be equivalent. We'll be talking about the same doses, essentially. But one point that I wanted to show here is that throughout the last 15 years, I can say, the first dose measles vaccination coverage has literally plateaued across the region. This is also mirrored by the coverage for BCG, by the coverage for the first dose of DPT and the third dose of DPT containing vaccines as well. And basically, with the increasing number of birth cohorts in the region from year to year, more and more doses are being given. But in terms of tipping the scales and increasing coverage, we're finding it very difficult, particularly because some of the populous countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, Angola, DRC basically have coverage that is much lower in some cases than the regional average. So basically, it drags regional coverage down. One of the things that we've been doing over the past few years is to try and support countries to move from using 10-dose vials for measles and MR towards using 5-dose vials. And basically, this is to try and make it easier for vaccinators at the vaccination post to open the vial and reconstitute the vaccine, even if there are 1 or 2 clients at the vaccination post. The current observation with the 10-dose vial is that in many cases, measles or MR vaccine is being given once a week or once every 2 weeks, or even in some cases, once a month, just to make sure that they can bring clients together and open vials and minimize wastage. So the fear of wastage is a major driver to missed opportunities for measles vaccination, and moving towards fewer dose vials, and currently Gavi is supporting 5-dose vials, we think will change the paradigm here and lead to better coverage. At least we've got some research findings that indicate towards that, and we're currently doing some assessments to measure the process, monitor the process, and measure the impact. So in the meantime, we rely on mass vaccination campaigns, and the figures that I have here are for the years 2023 and 2024, where we had campaigns in 28 countries as preventive campaigns, and 6 countries where big-scale outbreak response campaigns were conducted, and a total of about 165 million children were reached in these campaigns. So I put this here just to remind us that as part of the strategy to close the immunity gaps that are created from suboptimal routine coverage, we're trying to bridge that gap by doing periodic mass vaccination campaigns. And we also have a surveillance system that was established and has been in place since 2004 in many countries. And I think in a few countries like South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and so on, surveillance has been set up since the early 2000s, actually. And what we used to do in many countries was use the suspected measles case definition and take blood specimen and do serologic testing for IgM for measles. And if we get a negative test for measles, we screen that specimen for rubella as well. Currently, and this serial testing system was obliged at the time because rubella test kits were much more expensive than measles IgM test kits. In the last few years, I think about 6 or 7 years, we have encouraged countries to do serial testing because the cost of rubella test kits have significantly come down and are more or less equal to the measles test kits currently on the market. But also many countries and laboratories are finding it very easy to run the tests in parallel. So we still use the suspected measles case definition, mainly for bringing cases into the system, but then we run the tests for measles and rubella at the same time. And on average, we test somewhere around 120, 140 1,000 specimens, suspected cases through the surveillance system, and about 80 to 90,000 specimens are tested a year. For the last 3 years, you have the results here. We had 4,300 confirmed rubella cases in 2022, 4,800 in 2023, and a huge jump to 14,000 cases in our database last year. About 11 or 12,000 of these are actually from one country, from South Africa. So the significant jump in the incidence of confirmed rubella cases is also as a result of this big outbreak that we had in South Africa, which, as far as I understand, is still continuing to a certain extent. And the number of confirmed cases that we had over the last 3 years is somewhere around 52,000, 73,000, and 77,000, with an incidence around 60 cases per million population across the region. And definitely the incidence figures vary significantly from country to country. This is the map of incidence for 2024, showing in deep red and in burgundy colors the countries where we had incidence levels of more than 50 and more than 100 per million reported last year. Very few countries, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Algeria, Guinea-Bissau, and Sierra Leone had, and Eritrea had, incidence of measles less than 5 per million. Similarly, the island nations of Mauritius, Seychelles were also grouped in this particular group. This is for measles. For rubella, the picture is significantly different, with many countries actually currently reporting incidence levels of less than 1 per million, and more countries within the bracket of 1 to 5 per million. So in this chart, I'm trying to basically show how the incidence of rubella, the reported number of rubella cases, changed post-introduction in 26 countries where rubella vaccine introduction took place at least 5 years earlier. So these are countries where rubella vaccine was introduced in a mass campaign setting with Gavi support by 2018. So this red dotted line that you see is the cutoff point, the year where the mass vaccination campaign took place, be it in 2018 or earlier in 2013. We staggered them to align with this line, and the years shown, -1, -2, -4, are the 1, 2, 3, 4 years before the mass campaign, and subsequent years are after the mass campaign and routine introduction. So what we normally do is wide age range mass campaign, routine introduction, and then periodically every 3 to 4 years on average, countries do mass vaccination campaign with MR vaccine targeting under 5 children. So as you can see, significant decline in the number of rubella cases reported for up to 5 years post-introduction. And then for the few countries where we have data for up to 9 years post-introduction, you see that the low incidence has been maintained for all countries except for Tanzania, which in the 9th year post-campaign had a spike in the number of rubella cases reported, which is very clearly aligned with a delay in the periodic follow-up campaigns that the country was supposed to have had by just about the 8th year post-campaign. So after the initial campaign, mass vaccination campaign, the wide age range campaign, every 4 years or so, based on their routine coverage and population immunity, Tanzania has been supported to do its first campaign at 4 year post-initial campaign. The second campaign was supposed to have been done by year 8, but because they failed to plan for it timely enough and the campaign was pushed to year 9, the second campaign was pushed to year 9. Before we got to that level, starting in year 8, we had a spike of rubella cases, as you can see here. So for the ensemble of 26 countries, this is what I have by way of the average number of rubella cases in the 4 years pre-campaign in blue, and the average number of rubella cases for all the post-campaign years, with differing number of years, but the average in orange. And as you can see, for many countries, the level of reduction is more than 80%. We have had a few countries where reduction is around 40 to 60%. The only country on the left-hand side where the reduction was not seen, but actually an increase in the number of cases, was Benin. But here, the context is such that we're referring to only 1 year post-campaign data for Benin. And then this country also had very poor rubella surveillance data in the pre-campaign years as a comparator. So I just wanted to give you that context. And then I'll take you through 2 countries, Ghana and Zimbabwe, just as an example. This is the case of Zimbabwe, where in the blue bars, you see the number of rubella cases reported. And then the orange line is what we call the discard rate, or the non-measles febrile rash illness rate, just to show that the country has been maintaining relatively high surveillance sensitivity all throughout, with the target threshold being 2 and above, the non-measles febrile rash illness rate or the discard rate. So the catch-up campaign was done in 2014 with a significant reduction of rubella cases all throughout. The country conducted a follow-up campaign in 2019 and in 2022. But because the coverage that was achieved in these 2 years was suboptimal, 79% in both years, definitely immunity gaps occurred for both measles and rubella, with subsequent slight increase in the number of rubella cases reported in 2023. We had 132 cases, as you can see in the pie chart. Nearly half of them were in the age group 5 to 9, and 44% were below 5 years of age. So definitely, the cases that could have been avoided with high coverage in 2019 and high coverage in 2022 were not fully prevented, and that tells you to a certain extent why the age group of occurrence is in this particular age brackets. In the case of Ghana, similar picture with a significant reduction following the catch-up campaign that they did in 2013. However, throughout the years, there has been a gradual increase in the number of rubella cases, mainly because the campaigns were very widely spaced out. After 2013, Ghana did a campaign 6 years delay in 2019, even though it had fairly high coverage, 91%. But in between, the routine immunization coverage for Ghana started slipping a little bit. And as you can see, the majority of cases, 87%, are in the age bracket below 5 years of age. So not only high quality catch-up campaign and maintaining high routine coverage, but we need timely and high quality follow-up campaigns in order to keep rubella incidence down. So where are we going in the next few years? As I said, shifting the use of measles or MR vaccine vials from 10 dose to 5 dose will definitely help a lot in terms of minimizing missed opportunities within the routine immunization service. And then for those countries that have yet to endorse the policies for rubella vaccine introduction, we are continuing advocacy and technical support. The second dose, there's still a big dropout in many countries. We need to continue to ensure that the opportunity for vaccination in the second dose is strengthened in such a way that it contributes significantly to the measles and rubella elimination efforts. Finally, for the high-performing countries, and we still have a number of them in our region, we have a process for verifying measles and rubella elimination, and the process has started. The Regional Commission for Verification will be meeting in the next couple of months to review the application from 4 countries, and we are very confident that at least these 4 countries will be verified for having eliminated measles and rubella, which would be the first 4 for the African region. Thank you so much, and back to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really helpful overview of what's happening on the continent. Matthew, I don't know if it's you or if it's with sharing. Please go ahead. You can see that. Let us know if you are having any technical issues. But otherwise, you can please go ahead and share and start. Emmy and Matthew, thank you.
Okay. Can you confirm that you can see the screen shared?
Looks perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, I guess good afternoon. It's good morning for me. So good afternoon and good morning to everyone, depending on where you are. So it's exciting actually to follow up on Balcha's presentation, and we'll be presenting specifically here on some modeling work that was done in consideration of changes to the WHO SAGE policy on rubella introduction, rubella-containing vaccine introduction, and we're going to present this from a slightly historical perspective, because we're going to present to you much of the evidence that we presented, the work and evidence that was presented to SAGE, in support of an effort to change the criteria for rubella-containing vaccine introduction that was in fact adopted in September of 2025, and when SAGE recommended universal introduction of rubella-containing vaccine in all remaining countries, regardless of the classical criteria, and we'll mention that again here more as we go through. So first and foremost, I want to thank you to the NITAGs Support Hub for the opportunity to present today. And what we'll be doing here is presenting group work on behalf of the Vaccine Impact Modeling Consortium modelers, including folks at Penn State, where I am, UKHSA, and University of Georgia, where Amy Winter is, as well as colleagues from the Institute for Disease Modeling as well that have contributed to this. And this modeling work was done in coordination with the Measles and Rubella Partnership in preparation for our presentation to WHO SAGE in September of last year. So just what we want to do is start with some introduction and motivation. In fact, talk about where the classic criteria for introduction of rubella-containing vaccine came from. So first, what's classically referred to as the paradoxical effect for rubella occurs when low to intermediate RCV coverage leads to a rebound in CRS burden that exceeds the no vaccination levels or the pre-vaccination levels. This effect is support both theoretically and empirically. And to introduce this, we can start with the estimate of current annual incidence in a no vaccination setting, which is shown at the left. And we can see then the corresponding cumulative incidence over time in the graphic at the right. And this is just a schematic graphic here. Then when we introduce vaccination, we can see an initial transient decline in both rubella incidence and CRS incidence, which corresponds to slower cumulative incidence, a slower increasing line at the right. And the difference between the no vaccination and the vaccination scenarios gives the net benefit in terms of CRS cases that are avoided over time. And this initial decrease is a robust prediction of all models, regardless of the introduction scenario. We then expect a post-introduction rebound in CRS incidence after what's referred to as a honeymoon period that stabilizes at some new equilibrium annual incidence. And for simplicity in this schematic, this is illustrated assuming no change in demography over time. And so both the no vaccination cases and the new equilibrium are fixed. But we'll relax that when we present some of the specific results for countries in the future, in the later slides. And so for the demographic rates, in the 19 countries that we addressed in this modeling exercise, so these are the 19 countries that had yet to introduce RCV as of the start of 2024, this equilibrium is reached within about 30 years. And as such, we're only presenting projections out for about 30 years. And this was also deemed to be a programmatically relevant timescale. So of course, if the equilibrium incidence is lower than the no vaccination scenario, then the cumulative incidence is always lower, and you always have a positive net benefit. If the post-introduction equilibrium incidence of CRS is higher than the no vaccination baseline, and this can occur because the mean age of infection is then higher and rubella remains sufficiently prevalent, then we can get this classical paradoxical effect where CRS rates increase in the long term. And it's important to note again that this paradox does not manifest immediately, and the projections indicate that this will frequently not occur for more than a decade. And the degree of that exceedance in the future will depend on the vaccination coverage, the transmission rate, and the demography. It's also important to note that in this case, it's possible for there to be net benefit in terms of reduction of CRS burden over a given time horizon. And here the post-introduction decline in CRS offsets the future paradoxical effect over the time horizon that we've illustrated in the schematic. And if the paradoxical effect is sufficiently large, then we can get an outcome with both the paradoxical effect after some time in the future and net harm after a sufficient period of time. And that's always been the concern, and that was the concern on which the older policy was based. And so while the theory on this is robust and very well supported, the actual coverage threshold to prevent a future paradox or prevent the net benefit depends on the epidemiological and demographic context in any given country. And our empirical understanding of that has been progressing over time. The theory was first developed in settings where CRS was relatively rare because rubella was broadly circulating. And the theory for the long-term impact on CRS was developed in the 1980s. And so what I want to do is just sort of step through a little bit of the time course and history of how these of how this arose. So this started with some initial mathematical work that was done in the early to mid 1980s. First with a paper by Elizabeth Knox in 1981 that characterized this paradoxical effect. Sorry, the poll keeps popping up on my screen, so I have to move it away out of my screen. Anyway, the initial characterization of this paradoxical effect was first published in 1981, and this was done sort of in general as a mathematical presentation, and then some very explicit country level application of this was developed by Anderson and May a few years later, specifically in the context of England and Wales and some other applications in the United States. And in those cases, the indication was that vaccination coverage in the vicinity of 60 to 80% would be sufficient to avoid this paradoxical effect. Several studies were then done that estimated the underlying transmission rates for rubella. These were the basic reproduction rate of about 6 to 12. This was done based on age-specific serology or age of infection data that were available. The majority of that work was done in Europe and estimated comparatively values between sort of 6 and 8. And estimates that were done based on data from the African region, particularly in the Gambia and Ethiopia, gave some of the highest estimates that were available. And those became then the basis of the assumption of relatively high transmission rates for rubella in most of the African region. Then there were a series of observations in Greece and Costa Rica, where some studies were published that indicated a concern about the paradoxical effect, where several years after rubella introductions, there were some rubella outbreaks that led to high incidence of CRS, and that was again raised the alarm of the concern of the practical manifestation of this paradoxical effect. In 2000, then the WHO recommended a 80% vaccination coverage threshold as the criteria for introduction to avoid this paradoxical effect. That was then updated over time. In 2011, the criteria was updated to include consideration of SIAs. Some new modeling analysis was done in 2012 and 2013 that considered the impact of those SIAs, as well as the interaction between the threshold and the birth rates, identifying that in many cases, the 80% threshold was likely to be overly conservative. And again, that if the paradoxical effect were to happen, it would be likely to happen many years down the road. The WHO criteria were reevaluated and re-updated in 2020. And then some subsequent analysis by Amelia Vinicki, who contributed to this work, updated a lot of our epidemiological understanding about the transmission rates for rubella globally, now including many, many more countries, including a lot more countries from the African region. Thankfully, we can add a new time point to this time series. This was the time series of policy and understanding that we presented in early 2025, or in late 2024. But in September of 2024, we can add now an update to the WHO policy, which is based on the evidence that we'll present in the forthcoming slides. The WHO SAGE has now recommended that, in fact, the 80% criteria was indeed too conservative, and now the SAGE recommends universal introduction of RCV in all countries, regardless of their current MCV1 coverage, because the likelihood of this paradoxical effect is comparatively small over the long term. So the new work that we assembled to present to them was intended to update the understanding of the risks and consequences of RCV introduction with contemporary epidemiological data and programmatic activities like SIAs and wide age range introduction, and to provide a critical evaluation of that older guidance as a barrier to CRS control and rubella elimination. So collectively, the results of these new activities indicated a bunch of critical points that were considered for the change in policy. First, that the current CRS burden is significant and avoidable with vaccination. That the R0 or transmission rate for rubella in countries yet to introduce RCV is in fact lower than previously assumed, even at the subnational level, which reduces the risk of the potential paradoxical effect. That the expected birth rate declines and aging populations in many of the countries that have yet to introduce would in fact increase CRS rates over time in the absence of vaccination. So failure to act would indeed lead to an increase in CRS rates over time, and that routine immunization is currently sufficient to prevent that paradoxical effect in the countries remaining to introduce. And RI plus the campaigns that would be expected as a course of measles and rubella elimination activities can prevent that paradoxical effect in all of these countries. And so with that, I want to hand over to my colleague, Amy Winter. And Amy, just tell me and I'll advance the slides as we go through.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone. And Matt sort of started off the beginning of my section of the slides telling you what I'm going to tell you. And then I'll go through the results of the modeling slides, and then we'll summarize once again, more or less with the slide that Matt just presented. So before we jump into the specific modeling results, we first want to talk about the contemporary understanding of the epidemiology of rubella virus transmission as it relates to CRS risk. Next slide. As we discussed as Matt just discussed in the background section, the original work on the paradoxical effect of rubella vaccination was done assuming that retransmission rates, or the basic reproductive number of rubella, is equal to about 5 or 8 in European settings. But there was a few studies done in Ethiopia and I think it was Gambia that indicated that there was much higher R0, which would justify a more conservative stance and a higher coverage threshold for rubella introduction. What we've now done is built a large body of evidence using serological data collected and published over many years that argues that the transmission rate, or the basic reproductive number of rubella, is consistently in the range of 5 to 7, including countries in AFRO and MRO. And this alone implies that 80% coverage threshold is conservative relative to the earlier modeling work. Next slide. So this slide shows the transmission rates for 19 countries that had yet to introduce RCV as of July 2024. And we see that these estimates are consistent with the range of estimates that were also found in 2 subnational analyses in DRC and Nigeria. So the red lines on the left show the subnational analyses. So thus, there's no indication that even at subnational hotspots are outside the range of these national level estimates. Those subnational analyses have been published in peer-reviewed journals, and they're consistent with the national scale estimates we will present shortly and indicate the risk of the paradoxical effect is low. Next slide. We also need to consider the effects of demographic changes. So in the schematic that Matt showed earlier, he showed sort of a straight line, but in reality, we know that CRS cases are increasing in no vaccination scenario. So this is happening because birth rates are projected to decline from current rates in the 19 focal countries, according to the UNPD, even as populations in these countries continue to grow. Declining birth rates means that adults will compromise a larger relative proportion of the population. And because adults have fewer contacts than children, the average transmission rate will also fall. Next slide. As the average transmission rate falls, the rate at which susceptibles become infected also decreases. This results in an increase in the average age of infection. So note that while rubella infections will still largely occur in children, this increasing mean age of infection also means that an increasing proportion of women will reach childbearing age without previously being infected or still susceptible. Next slide. The net result of this is an increase in the number of CRS cases per 100,000 live births projected into the future in the absence of vaccination. On average, each 10% decline in the crude birth rate leads to around a 10% increase in the number of CRS cases per 100,000 live births. Once again, this is in the absence of vaccination. Next slide. So contemporary estimates of rubella transmission rate indicate that the 80% criterion is conservative, and this holds for subnational analyses for the 2 largest countries, DRC and Nigeria. Projected changes in birth rates are expected to lead to an increase in the number of CRS cases per 100,000 live births and the absence of vaccination, leading to an opportunity cost of delayed introduction. So this was a pretty big it's something that evidence has been building over many years, but just making the point that if you do nothing, the problem gets worse. So now we'll present the results of modeling a range of introduction scenarios in the 19 countries that had yet to introduce RCV as of July 2024. These simulations consider realistic changes in demography over the next 30 years, and the introduction scenarios reflect current programmatic activities with pessimistic to optimistic coverage assumptions that reflect measured coverage. All scenarios were run using 2 independent models, and technical details have been published. So we're going to jump into the scenarios that were simulated. For each country and model, we ran a no vaccine baseline scenario that accounted for future changes in demography. In addition to that no vaccine scenario, we also ran 17 different rubella vaccine scenarios, as you can see here. In all 17 vaccine scenarios, we assume that routine coverage remains constant at the mean of the 2018 and 2019 levels, per the WUNIC estimates. In other words, we do not assume any improvement of RI into the future. This is conservative assumption because after rubella vaccine introductions, typically we do see increases. Next slide. We then assume that introductory campaigns are either wide age range, up to 14 years of age, indicated in purple, or a narrow age range up to 4 years of age indicated in blue. The coverage is assumed to vary between 60% and 90%, which is represented by the shading. This range encompasses true campaign performance based on empirical data. Next slide. Then we have continued campaigns after introduction that are all assumed to be narrow age range follow-up conducted every 4 years. And this is meant to be consistent with the current measles SIAs that would be conducted now with MR following introduction. Next slide. So we can take a look at the layout of all of these 17 vaccine scenarios and how they're related to one another. The scenarios are organized from the most comprehensive at the top, which have the recommended schedule of a wide age range introduction campaign, continued follow-up campaigns, and those are arranged from the most optimistic to the pessimistic coverage levels. So scenario 1 has 90% coverage for introductory campaign as well as follow-up campaigns. Then, as we move down the rows and the coverage drops to reflect more pessimistic performance of 60% coverage for both introductory and follow-up campaigns. But all of these first 8 scenarios are based on the recommended schedule of the wide age range introduction campaign and follow-up campaigns. And then we look at some variations on that recommended schedule. There's first a set of scenarios where we assume only a narrow age range campaigns. This would reflect the case where there's no wide age range introduction and you simply incorporate MR into the current measles SIAs. And then we also look at a set of scenarios where we only have a wide age range introduction and no follow-up campaigns. And finally, in scenario 17, this is a routine only scenario where there's no follow-up or introductory campaigns. And so while this is not the recommendation, RI only is an important scenario and that it reflects the scenario for which those initial paradoxical effect modeling was done in the 1980s and 2000s. Next slide. Now with those 18 scenarios in mind, 1 no vaccine scenario and 17 vaccine scenarios, we did forward projections to evaluate the consequences of rubella vaccine introduction in respect to 1, the net benefit in terms of reduction CRS over a period of time, and 2, the risk of the paradoxical effect or the exceedance of baseline in any individual year. So for each country and scenario, we generated projections of the annual number of CRS cases and cumulative CRS cases so we can quantify both the net benefit represented by the figure on the right, and whether the no vaccination baseline will ever be exceeded and when, represented by the figure on the left. We'll start by looking at the results showing the 30-year net benefit, because this is the lower bar for success, given it's possible to have a net benefit over 30 years, even with an increase over the no vaccine baseline before those 30 years are up. Next slide. So here we summarize the results of all the simulations for all the countries for both models that were run. And we're specifically focusing on the net benefit of CRS reduction over 30 years. The scenarios will be indicated in the rows, and the order and the color scheme matches the previous slide. The results from the 2 models will be shown in paired columns for each country. The value in each cell is the net benefit, or the percent reduction in the number of CRS cases, and each scenario compared to the no vaccine scenario over the 30-year simulation. A color scale is darker for smaller reductions. So for example, we see here for Afghanistan, the 2 models predict a 96% reduction in CRS cases over 30 years in the most optimistic scenario at the top, and a 48 to 57% reduction in CRS cases over 30 years with introduction via RI alone at the very bottom. Next slide. So now we're going to be looking at all the countries, and we see, as expected, the percent reduction is larger in the more optimistic scenarios, looking from the top to the bottom. Next slide. And notably, all scenarios indicate a positive net benefit, meaning that there's fewer CRS cases over 30 years for all introduction scenarios because they all have percent reductions. Next slide. So those results represent findings based on this right-hand figure, which is the lower bar But we also need to be concerned about the possibility of exceeding the no vaccine baseline in any individual year and the time between introduction and when that happens. And so the next set of figures will illustrate the likelihood of annual CRS burden exceeding the no vaccination baseline at any point into the future. Next slide. Here we are showing these results in the same tabular format. The rows represent the scenarios in the order they were before. The countries are in columns, and they are ordered slightly differently. The order will make sense momentarily. So the table indicates whether the CRS cases and the no vaccine baseline is ever exceeded in a single year. Each country and scenario is color-coded, where green indicates that neither the UGA nor the UKHSA model ever predict an exceedance of CRS cases above baseline. And yellow is the cases where one model predicts an exceedance above baseline, and red or orange means both models predict an exceedance above baseline for that particular scenario. So we see for the most optimistic scenarios, the top four there, where there's a wide age range introduction and high quality follow-up campaigns of 90% coverage, neither model predicts ever exceeding baseline in any individual year. Next slide. This also holds if follow-ups are only 60% coverage. Next slide. And it holds if there is no wide age range campaign for all follow-up coverages greater than 60%. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Even though with a, go back one slide, Matt, sorry. Even though scenarios with a narrow age range introduction don't exceed baseline, they still have more burden than ones with a wide age range introduction, as we saw above with the percent reduction slides. Okay. So it's actually only under scenarios without any follow-up campaigns that when we begin to see concerns about this paradoxical effect. Meaning there are some countries in which the mean CRS cases is predicted to exceed the no vaccination baseline before the end of the simulation. Now, what we've done is that we've also added numbers to the cells which represent the average number of years between introduction and when the exceedance of baseline CRS cases occurs. So in this case, we see 5 countries here in yellow, where one model, the UGA model, predicts that CRS burden will exceed the no vaccination baseline. And in one country, Somalia here in red, where both models predict the future CRS burden will exceed the no vaccination baseline. In all cases, this exceedance will not occur for at least 14 years following introduction. Without sustained follow-up campaigns, some countries may see an increase in the annual CRS incidence above the no vaccination baseline scenario after 14 or more years following introduction, even with high-quality catch-up campaign. But 14 countries will see no increase in CRS even without follow-up campaigns. And lastly, we look at the scenario with routine only, and we see 13 countries will see no increase in annual CRS cases above the no vaccination baseline. Next slide.
All right, so now we want to return back to sort of a summary of these collective results. So again, point one that we started with, the current CRS burden is significant and avoidable. Right? And while we see model-to-model variation in the projections of current CRS burden, both the subnational and 2 national scale models predict thousands of current cases of CRS per year in DRC and Nigeria. These are the 2 countries for which our groups were able to compare both national and subnational scale models. All of our models predict large potential reductions in CRS under optimistic scenarios with 70 to 99% reductions of CRS over 30 years in all cases. All models predict no paradoxical effect in any country as long as the campaign coverage is greater than 60%. We've also shown that the expected demographic change will actually lead to an increase in CRS rate per 100,000 live births in the absence of vaccination. So maintaining the status quo would lead to an increase in CRS. All introduction scenarios lead to a significant reduction in CRS over a 10 to 15-year time period, and a net reduction over 30 years. And finally, routine immunization is currently sufficient to prevent the paradoxical effect in all of the remaining countries that have yet to introduce rubella-containing vaccine, and that continued campaigns consistent with existing and planned measles control activities can prevent that paradoxical effect in all countries at their current RI levels. And so, in summary, this is the set of evidence that was brought to SAGE, as well as a number of printed materials that supported all of this. That was brought to SAGE, WHO SAGE, in September of 2024, and subsequent to that presentation, WHO SAGE made the recommendation for universal introduction of rubella-containing vaccination into all national programs, regardless of their current RI levels. And so, with that, we want to just offer some thanks to the very many people across many organizations and many groups throughout the Measles and Rubella Partnership that contributed to the work that was presented here today, and we thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Amy and Matt. I'm just going to ask Ijeoma to take over for this question and answer session, which she will manage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruzania, and thank you to Balcha, Amy, and Machi for very fantastic presentations. I thought there was packed with information and very helpful. The way you're taking us through, the thinking behind how the recommendation to introduce rubella vaccine across countries, regardless of transmission rates and coverage levels that can be achieved. I thought that was very fantastic presentations. We had two questions pop up. I think one already was answered by Balcha. I think both questions were addressed to Balcha, but I think the first question, yes, was from Mustafa from the Ministry of Health in Somalia, and wanting to know whether countries that don't meet the WHO criteria for introducing rubella vaccination program, but seeing rising cases of rubella, what's the advice to them? But I think that has already been answered. Unless there's something else you want to add, Amy or Matthew or Balcha, but I think that question has already been answered due to the modeling work that has been done. The new recommendation is to implement rubella vaccine. But I'll let Balcha, maybe if you want to say something quickly to that, and perhaps if you could also, highlight what support the region is providing to countries on wishing to introduce rubella vaccine, and how these countries can access such support from the region. Thanks, Balcha.
Thank you so much, Ijeoma. So I think the technical background and the modeling work that Amy and Matthew very capably went through basically was the basis against which the guidance to remove that restriction of 80% first dose coverage for measles before rubella introducing. That was how it came about. So currently, with this knowledge, new modeling result and deliberations of the SAGE, that criteria has been removed. All countries are allowed to get support to introduce. Now, for countries like Somalia, for instance, who are Gavi eligible, they follow the usual process just like they would follow any other application to make sure that they submit their applications and get the support for an initial wide age range mass vaccination campaign, followed by routine introduction immediately. And we're talking about MR vaccine now. We're not talking about the mumps component. We're talking about MR vaccine support, which is available through Gavi. And then, of course, because measles will continue to be a problem, depending on the levels of routine coverage that we have in the immunity gap for measles, countries will continue to do follow-up campaigns with MR vaccine every 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years, depending on the rate of accumulation of measles susceptible populations. So I think that question has been fairly well addressed in the presentation from Matt and Nemi. Thank you.
Thank you, Boucher. But before we go into the second question, I just have a quick follow-up question to that, Boucher, if you may. And maybe also this could also be a question to the modelers. To what extent are these models being used, and what support available to countries in terms of understanding the budgetary implications of these strategy? We're talking about supplementary immunization activities happening every few years. Is there any predictions as to what the cost implications will be for countries? And I think this is now very relevant given the current climate of declining international aid. What are the programmatic implications, and to what extent there is support to countries to actually implement some of these strategies? Boucher, maybe you go first, please, and then I can.
Okay, thank you so much. So, irrespective of rubella vaccine introduction, there is already a system built in to try and predict the rate at which countries will need to implement measles follow-up campaigns to address the measles problem. Unless the first and the second dose measles vaccination coverage has been sustained at 90 to 95% coverage for some years, countries for the foreseeable future will need to do some degree of mass vaccination activity. It could be nationwide, like is done in many countries, or it could be implemented in a very selective, targeted manner, depending on how good the data is to allow us to target our mass vaccination activities. So that support is already embedded for the Gavi eligible countries through Gavi, but for the non-Gavi eligible countries, these are things that we engage with to help countries understand the level of immunity gaps there are for measles. So as long as they're using MR vaccine, they will continue to also close the immunity gaps for rubella. But measles is the most highly infectious and the most susceptible to cause complications and deaths in young infants. So we usually base our calculations and the pace of measles follow-up campaigns based on the immunity gaps for measles. With regards to the cost implications, again, many countries have done these campaigns over a period of 20 years. Through their planning, the Gavi eligible ones go through a process of budgeting, most of which is covered by Gavi. The only challenge is for the non-Gavi eligible countries. And as I speak, we have problems with Angola and Gabon, for instance, not very keen to do follow-up campaigns, even in the presence of large-scale outbreaks. So that is something that we'll have to engage in terms of advocacy and technical support with every country. Thank you.
Thank you, Boucher. So I think the second question is on what is a bad case of rubella. I'm not quite sure, is this a medical related question, but
I'm afraid it may have been the AI translation that wrote the word bad. In what context, I do not know. But I think that's what happened. And okay. I didn't say anything about bad case of rubella. Every case of rubella or measles is definitely, of course, bad if you look at it as a mother or as a health worker.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Boucher.
So Ejima, can I just add?
Yeah,
I think the thing that came up with Matthew and Ami's presentation, which is where the paradoxical thing comes in, is to realize that the terrible thing you want is a situation where you get clinical rubella in children, even if it can be quite severe, and by exchanging that for a situation in which you get congenital rubella syndrome, which is the worst case of rubella that you really want to avert as a priority. I don't know if that came through that Boucher, but yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, that's one way of putting it, even though I don't think I spoke about CRS, at least in my presentation. But yeah, you're right.
So I think, Balta, this is also for you around the reasons for the spike in rubella cases in Ghana, or was there programmatic issues around stockouts of vaccines? I think somebody already answered. I think this was mostly a comment, actually, on referring to your presentation, Balcha, on the cases in Ghana. I think
actually, the second paragraph was my response to the question, Ijoma.
Yes. Yeah. So let's keep that one. Okay, this is for Matthew or Amy. Wanting to understand more, a bit more about this paradoxical effect, and what, in very maybe lay terms, what it actually means, just so people can relate more to it. Thank you. Matthew, do you want to go first? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So this will sort of reiterate, I think, some of the things that came up before, and I'll try and say this again as I'll start as sort of simple as possible, right? So again, as has been raised, infection with rubella results in often a relatively mild clinical presentation in children and adults, right? So that's rubella infection and the symptomatic and clinical presentation of rubella infection. However, the clinical presentation of rubella infection in pregnant women who are exposed early in their pregnancy can lead to the constellation of symptomatic presentation called congenital rubella syndrome. And that is much more dangerous and much more concerning, and that can lead to a variety of developmental and neurological outcomes in the developing fetus. And I believe the numbers are about 30% of those infections are expected to result in CRS, and the vast majority of those children born will be born with neurological deficiencies and are unlikely to live past their 5th year of life. And so that is the concern, is the concern of infection of women of childbearing age with rubella. In the absence of vaccination, when rubella is circulating at high levels and is very common, then disproportionately children are the ones getting infected with rubella. And by the time you're old enough to be pregnant, you're very likely to have been exposed to rubella through infection. As vaccination increases, rubella becomes more rare, and more children make it through childhood and into adulthood and to childbearing age without having been previously exposed to rubella. And we can get this, what's referred to as the paradoxical effect, that is a numerical increase in CRS, right? The bad outcome, even though numerically there's less rubella around. So there's less rubella, but you run into it later in life, leading to that increase in CRS. Now, of course, if you vaccinate enough, then both numbers go down and the paradox goes away, right? And figuring out the break point between how much is enough vaccination has been the subject of this debate in WHO policy for the last 40 years now. And the new work indicates that the vaccination threshold that had been the prior concern was overly conservative, right? And in fact, the paradox goes away at a much lower vaccination threshold, especially in the context of continued SIAs and campaigns. So in fact, the concern about this paradox was a policy barrier to introduction of rubella-containing vaccine into countries that were not yet meeting that 80% threshold. So hopefully that addresses at the lowest level both some of the clinical presentation and the logic behind how that paradox arises.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Next question, please.
I think there are none that seem to be online now, Ijoma, and I think there's one here that is there. I think that the last one before that was running a bit behind. Yeah, but please go ahead with this one. And then we'll just move on with the online.
Okay, there are a few other questions in the chat, so perhaps you can collate them and maybe somebody can speak to them. There's some directed to Matthew in the chat, but let's take this last one, Rizani, like you said, and then move on. So I think this has to do with the COVID, why there wasn't, to Balcha's presentation and why there didn't seem to be any change in coverage, MCV1 coverage during COVID. And what is that an artifact of maybe smoothing of the data? But maybe you can answer to that, Balcha.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very good question, actually. So during COVID, I think around 2014, 2015, as you all know, there was the big Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which resulted in significant declines in routine immunization coverage, particularly for Guinea and for Liberia, but to a certain extent also for Sierra Leone. So there were hard lessons learned at that time with regards to how we need to protect the routine immunization program in a context like that, which puts huge pressure on the health system and the immunization system in general. So one of the things that we did very early during the COVID pandemic was to try and ensure that immunization and the vaccination of children is protected as much as possible. Of course, there was a period of confusion and lots of things were stalled, but we immediately kick-started that communication and that push so that routine immunization services are maintained with some social distancing and taking care of the usual infection control measures that should be taken for COVID. So that was one effort that was done uniformly across our region. And actually, even before the end of 2020, we managed to implement measles follow-up campaigns in a few countries. Irrespective of the fear with COVID and everything, we felt that the fear of measles outbreak and deaths of children that risk was much higher and needed to be addressed as much as possible. Now, with regards to the regional coverage figures, as you saw, it was just about 2 percentage points at regional level that declined during 2020 and 21 and then picked up immediately. But mind you, there is significant inter-country difference over there. While many countries managed to maintain their coverage fairly well with a little bit of a dip, other countries actually suffered significantly, while a few countries maintained on there. So it is a matter of that smoothing out of the curve when you average it to 47 countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Balcha. Back to you, Rizani. Maybe we could make a plan for collating the remaining questions and answering them outside this platform.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for this. And just acknowledging you, Emilia. Even though our time schedule kind of clashed with your meetings, you've got really amazing two colleagues here who managed to cover everything in your absence. And that's the beauty of having a beautiful consortium. Thank you. The next two speakers, I'll ask them to go, one after another, and we'll put the question and answer section right. We'll combine the two question and answer sections. Please don't hesitate to continue writing any more questions in the chat box because they can be answered still if you've got any of those. The first speaker is Sheetal Sila, who is based here at the University of Cape Town. And she will just be reflecting really on the initiatives that are there to support vaccines and immunization decisions. And I think she will also give us beyond just the continent, the perspective that is at levels of WHO, for example, within this space. And after that, we'll have Mama Pudi Kubiane, who will talk about another area, which is of tuberculosis in terms of vaccine introductions. She is also based at the University of Cape Town in the Health Economics and Epidemiology Research Office that is otherwise known as HERO. So after those, we can have more questions, but please continue typing some questions so that we can make up on time, because we can see that these are topics that you're very much interested in. Shito, you can start sharing your screen.
Thank you so much, Ridzani, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. Greetings to everyone on the call. I'm just going to make sure that we can all see the slide deck appropriately.
Perfect. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have been tasked to comment on modeling initiatives to support vaccines and immunization decisions. And I also wanted to add additional information that would be of interest to many of you on the call today, which is, how do you get involved in modeling initiatives? When should you get involved? And what might your role be? So perhaps first, as an introduction, the Immunization and Vaccines Related Implementation Research Advisory Committee, which we call IVARAC, and was introduced by the chair of our session today in the introduction, is the principal advisory group to the WHO. And this group provides an independent appraisal of and provides advice on implementation research related to vaccines and immunizations with the aim of informing public health decisions. What's quite important is that this IVARAC committee is an advisory group, or acts as an advisory group to the WHO, and reviews modeling evidence, and particularly those that have been raised by the SAGE committee as vitally important to assess. And so IVARAC spends time, and the committee members who have different types of expertise, all related to modeling and immunization and implementation research, they together advise on modeling best practices, quantitative methods in immunization, on implementation research, and the impact and value of vaccines, which all together help countries and regions, and on the global agenda as well, help us to be able to implement more effective immunization programs. So the IVARAC committee, just to show you carefully where, the importance of a committee and its key role in supporting decision-making, it's one of 3 primary committees that provide advice to SAGE and for SAGE's deliberation, all of which are in support of the Immunization Agenda 2030. So IVARAC's role is quite pivotal. Now, where that affects us today in the presentation is that IVARAC has 3 levels of engagement. The first level of engagement, as you can see from the picture, is very much at the global level, where we are providing advice to SAGE and reviewing information and evidence that will come through to SAGE. But IVARAC also engages with stakeholders and across WHO departments, and reviews global analyses in modeling, economic, and other impact analysis. At the regional level, IVARAC plays an important role, particularly with the regional offices of WHO and the NITAGs, and helps to increase engagement with respect to the agenda that IVARAC considers in regards to methods and analyses, modeling analyses that have been done at the regional level. But IVARAC also facilitates link-ups with international stakeholders to bring modelers and your decision makers together at the regional level, and supporting NITAGs in that way. And in many ways, the meetings of the IVARAC do form a platform to help discuss regionally relevant research and evidence with regional stakeholders. But many of us are also concerned at the country level, and where the IVARAC committee from the WHO supports at a country level is that the Secretariat and the country offices engage in modeling and economic and other analyses, as well as capacity building and strengthening at the country level. And IVARAC provides a platform that can provide advice to national stakeholders, and quite importantly, link up national stakeholders, decision makers, those involved in immunization, with decision support, like the modelers that we've heard on the call and will be hearing on later after my presentation today, to link up modelers such as these groups with national stakeholders. So that's the role that the IVRAC committee plays. But what I would like us to maybe reflect on are, what are some of the decisions that mathematical modeling can support? So let's take a step back. We've just heard an excellent presentation on rubella vaccination, and that was looking at scenarios on the introduction of a rubella vaccination. But is that the typical type of decision that modeling can support, or can modeling be used for other purposes as well? So the answer is, of course, yes. Modeling can be very informative across a range of decisions. For example, assessing the health impact of a current vaccination strategy. If this is the type of information that is required for advocacy, for continued support of the current strategy, or even an evaluation of the strategy itself, mathematical modeling can be quite useful. We've just seen a presentation on designing future strategy through assessing the impact of introduction of vaccines, or it could be in other cases, boosters or increased coverage. We can also explore the impact that vaccination will have in addition to other preventative and treatment options. In many countries exploring the use of malaria vaccination, we see that we need to evaluate the impact of introducing the malaria vaccine, but in addition to ongoing long-lasting insecticide-treated net distribution, or in addition to seasonal malaria chemoprevention. But we can also evaluate the impact that vaccination, especially with respect to targeted strategies, can have with risk groups. We have a focus on the zero-dose population, for example, or populations, perhaps mobile and migrant populations, or other typically difficult to reach populations. And never forget that along with evaluating the epidemiological impact in terms of cases averted or deaths averted, it's very important to use a methodology like modeling to provide evidence to support economic costing, to provide a costing and a financial and a budgeting analysis alongside the health impact evaluation. And also, where we have vaccines that are hypothetical or they have not been developed yet, we can use modeling to help determine what those preferred product characteristics are to support vaccine developers to create appropriately targeted vaccines to be evaluated through trials. So these are just a few examples of some of the typical decisions that mathematical modeling can support, and these might be relevant to you as members of NITAGs, as implementers, as EPI managers, as members of RITAGs, and so on. Okay, so what I'd like to perhaps pose as a question now, and for you to be thinking about is, how do you actually get involved in a modeling analysis? Is it something that you get involved in at the start, at the end? What does it take for someone in a decision-making seat or in an advisory group to support a policy change or decisions? What is your role really in a mathematical modeling analysis? So the questions I'd like to deal with in our seminar today, do I as a decision maker or an advisor need to be involved at all? Who are the key participants to generate modeling studies or modeling results, as we've seen in the previous rubella study and as we will see in the future TB study? When do you actually need to be involved in the development of this throughout this modeling analysis? And what happens if you're not in fact involved in an ongoing modeling analysis, but you are reviewing an existing modeling study or a modeling exercise that has been already completed? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to deal with today. So firstly, do you need to be involved? And the answer to that is yes, definitely yes. And if we have to probe further as to why you as decision makers or those involved in support of providing evidence or advice on immunization questions, is because you are the people who are faced with the immunization questions that are needed to be answered. Whether a NITAG is provided with a question like, should we introduce rubella vaccination, or should we have a measles supplementary immunization activity? You would be faced with such questions that would be relevant that need to be answered and would need to have some evidence provided for in order to support a decision that needs to be made. You also would be armed with knowing when these decisions would be made. So perhaps a question is brought to a NITAG today, and the advice needs to be provided for an upcoming meeting of the EPI program in the Ministry of Health in 3 months' time. So you would be armed with knowing when these decisions are made, because as many of my modeling colleagues on the call will be able to tell you, these modeling projects tend to take a while. But if decisions need to be made soon, there's also differences in methodology that can be applied to provide some quicker answers that may be not as robust or detailed as answers that take, or recommendations that take a longer time to produce, but can still be useful in supporting decisions that need to be made at a short time frame. And the COVID-19 pandemic was one example of where this was the case for almost all modeling related decisions that needed to be made. You also know what data is available. And it is this data that powers the models. The models are not just based on assumptions and mathematics. They are powered by the data. They are made relevant by the data that are used as inputs. And as experts in country, you know what data is available, what the quality of that data is, and to which samples that data is related, applies to within your country. And so you'll be able to make an assessment on which data types need to be included, or data sets need to be included in the modeling analysis. But very importantly, you have experience in understanding the implementation challenges and the population socioeconomic and behavioral characteristics of the population who will be receiving these vaccines. And it is this experience that is vitally important to helping modelers to make the scenarios and the recommendations that come out of our model feasible, or to take these implementation factors into account and socio-economic and behavioral characteristics, build them into our model so that the recommendations that are made are going to be relevant across the risk groups that are of interest to an EPI program or to an immunization advisory group. So in short, do you need to be involved? Absolutely, yes. And so you might be asking, is it just you who needs to be involved? Who else needs to be involved? And I've got a list down here just showing you that it's a number of different groups. So those involved in the actual decision making, deliberating over what the policy will be or what the decision will be with respect to introducing a vaccine or not, or having an immunization campaign, or changing a targeted age range. The decision makers are key players. The modelers are also, of course, key players or key stakeholders in a national modeling study. Advisory bodies who advise your decision makers will be playing an invaluable role in a modeling study, as are disease specialists, implementers, and let's not forget the general public, who will be, as a chief stakeholder, receiving the outcomes of this analysis through implemented policy. And so with these stakeholders, what you find is that we're often having many meetings throughout a modeling engagement across the breadth of these stakeholders, and also in those meetings deliberating on data that are available and having discussions together to formulate assumptions and so on. So let's look in a little more detail into these roles themselves. So let's start with the modelers. And with the modelers, what we can see, the modelers are typically involved in understanding what the modeling question is. What question will their model be able to answer? They will be involved in doing an analysis of existing data and doing a literature review or analysis. They will be involved in actually developing the model themselves. So writing up the computer code, formulating the structure of the model that will tell you that will form the engine of the modeling analysis. So that will govern how disease is transmitted, how vaccines are implemented, and what the impact of those vaccines will be on a wider population. Modelers are also involved in what we call scenario analysis. And so my colleagues before me just presented an analysis with 17 scenarios or 17 options, we could call them, that the model is exploring of the future. We can't go and implement 17 different types of scenarios to test out their impact, but on a computer, we definitely can. So using mathematical modeling, we are able to investigate a range of scenarios, even if we don't intend to implement all of them. So the modelers are involved in developing and implementing the scenario analysis and assisting with interpretation. So what does it all mean, as we saw in the last few slides of my colleague's presentation on rubella? But from the decision maker's side and the advisory body side, looking at those two together, you are involved in the decision problem. So understanding what decisions are needed to be made, we first establish that and then look to how can a model support? So the modeling question will be providing some evidence, a piece of the evidence towards solving the decision problem that you are faced with as a NITAG, in support of as a NITAG, as advisory body, or as a decision maker. And the modeling is just one piece of the evidence that will be graded in order to grade and provide valuable recommendations. But as decision makers and members of advisory bodies, you're also assessing the feasibility of the studies themselves. You are reviewing the assumptions that the model is based on and the data that is used to power the model, to drive the model, because you will know best if these assumptions are relevant for your context, if they are plausible, as well as if the data are the right data sets to be using, and where data is not available, what assumptions should be made. But you also, along with the modelers, need to be a part of the scenario analysis to define these scenarios in order to assess, well, what different scenarios, what is the range of scenarios or options do I want the model to explore so that I can form a set of recommendations to take through to my Ministry of Health. And of course, support interpretation as well. But if you look at the disease specialists, they would be providing information or being able to synthesize information on the disease itself, their expertise being in understanding the epidemiology and clinical aspects of the disease themselves. They would also help in synthesizing data that have arisen from different vaccine trials or clinical trials, field studies that have been conducted, and helping to review the assumptions and the data. The role of implementers is also critical in a modeling study because implementers help to review the assumptions and the data and to assess feasibility of these assumptions. And they too would be involved in defining these scenarios, which don't always have to be about an increased coverage or an increased or different timing of a vaccine introduction, or whether we should have a follow-up campaign and an SIA, as well as we saw in the previous analysis. Some of the scenarios could also be about implementation relevant assumptions. Perhaps it is a time to scale up. Do we achieve an 80% coverage immediately, or does it take 2 years to scale up? From initial introduction to reaching that 80% coverage. So these are all implementation considerations that help to provide authenticity or feasibility on these scenarios that are modeled. And of course, the general public, they should be stakeholders in formulating these decision problems, in supporting the interpretation and analysis as well, because they will be the primary stakeholders receiving the recommendations of the modeling study. So now that we have a good idea about when you need to be involved in a modeling study, you're probably realizing that it can be a long study, that you need to be involved in many steps and perhaps even throughout the study. And that's why I would like to highlight that with the NITAG Support Hub, with the niche program is founded on the principle of co-creation. And it's one of the core values of the niche program. And the importance of co-creation, the ideology or the value behind co-creation is that this process allows and fosters an environment of shared ownership between the country decision makers, advisory groups, and the modelers, and the modelers who are performing the studies. And in that way, it helps to improve accuracy. It helps to improve relevance, feasibility, and enhances your model's relevance for decision making. So it is by working together throughout the process, you are able to ensure that the model and its forthcoming recommendations will be relevant for the decisions that are being made at the time. And that is why it is really important that throughout the study, you are a part of the modeling process, as are the modelers, and a relationship of mutual respect and co-creation is fostered from the very beginning. So perhaps if we look at the last question then, because it's not always the case that you have the ability to be involved in a modeling study. Sometimes we have modeling evidence put before us that we weren't involved in. So we weren't able to be involved in a co-created way, even as I was just describing. So modeling to support immunization can take many forms. One is you request or commission a local modeling exercise for your setting, as was discussed just now. Or you could be reviewing a paper or a publication or a guideline, perhaps that comes from the WHO, that includes modeling analysis and recommendations at a global scale. Or you could also be reviewing a modeling study that was performed in another country setting, perhaps a neighboring country to you, perhaps a country from another continent. And so these are different ways in which you could be exposed to modeling. And you might ask yourself, well, if I'm reviewing a modeling analysis that has already been completed, can I take those recommendations and those results and apply them directly to my country, just like that? So if the recommendation is you have to have this targeted range with introducing a vaccine X, and it has to be with an SIA, but a follow-up campaign is not necessary. Now, can you take such a recommendation or finding from one study and apply it immediately to your setting with no question? Now, the answer to that is no, because every study that has been completed needs to be assessed to see if it is relevant to your setting. And if it is relevant to your setting, there's an extra step for how to translate that modeling recommendations to make it relevant and implementable for your setting itself. So here are a few key questions you can ask. If you are reviewing a modeling study that has already been completed, you could ask, what are the vaccine characteristics that were employed in that modeling study? So what type of vaccine was it? Was it even a relevant vaccine? Perhaps you are considering introducing a DTP booster dose through a DTaP dose of a vaccine, and the study has done a TD vaccine. Would that be equally relevant to you? Perhaps not. And so you ask yourself, is the vaccine relevant? What is the efficacy assumption and the duration of protection? What dosage schedules were used in that study? Did that study have implemented perhaps a dose schedule, but you're considering a 1-dose schedule? So will those results be directly applicable to you? How will that impact you? What is your population demography and health-seeking pattern? Are they similar to where the study was conducted? How might those impact vaccine interventions? We just heard in the previous study about the impact that declining birth rates in many countries and changing demography, should I say, in many countries in the future would have on CRS estimates. And so not all countries would necessarily, just for the sake of demography, have the same impact on vaccine interventions, from vaccine interventions. Health infrastructure also matters. So did the study deliver the vaccines in the same manner that you are thinking of delivering the vaccines in your country? Does that have an impact on coverage, on cost particularly? what are the characteristics of your population with respect to income, educations, or other socioeconomic or vulnerabilities, social vulnerabilities in the population? Are there disparities in your country that might influence vaccine access, acceptance, and utilization? So it's quite a lot of work to translate a modeling study that has already been done, but very essential work. So at the IVRAC, we have a subgroup that is tasked with supporting countries, NITAGs and RITAGs, and even at the global level with respect to helping to translate the impact of vaccine-related modeling in support of policy and program decisions. And so what the subgroup is doing right now is that it has been formulated so that we can help countries with the interpretation of modeling results, whether you are a part of a modeling study or you are reviewing a modeling study from a publication or from another guideline. And in order to do this, we're undertaking a few key steps. We have already conducted, and some of you on the call may even have been involved in this, we have already conducted a decision maker needs assessment across the globe to help inform what content needs to be evaluated in the work of this subgroup. And we are in the process of developing a guidance document that focuses on translating modeling in order to support evidence-informed decision-making for immunization. This work is ongoing and is likely to undergo review in the next few months by the IVRAC committee itself. And what we have planned is not just to develop a guidance and to publish a guidance. We have also planned training and ongoing support to be provided by the IVRAC subgroup committee with stakeholders around the world through country workshops for NITAG groups, for those involved in national immunization strategy, and the country-led assessment for prioritization on immunization. And so what we would like out of this guidance is to be able to workshop the guidance with relevant stakeholders such as yourselves, so that the interpretation of modeling becomes an easier task. And once the interpretation of modeling becomes an easier task, we start to see its value in supporting decision-making, which will hopefully lead to a greater and accelerated uptake of modeling in the future. And so our end goal of this, and this is really, I think, the end goal of all modelers on the call today and the niche program, is that we really hope that through modeling, global, regional, and country level decision makers are going to be able to effectively use evidence generated through models in order to inform strategy, policy, and program decisions in immunization. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and we're very happy to take questions. Thanks, and back to you, Rizani.
Thank you very much for that, Sheetal. And I'm just going to ask Mama Budi to start sharing her screen. And then please, if you can just check, there are some questions already that have been posted there, Sheetal. If you can answer questions that are on the panel, others on AI and so forth, it would be great. But we'll see if we'll have a bit of time at the end to just take a few more questions. Thank you.
Should I go ahead?
Please go ahead, Mama.
Okay. Hello, everyone. As introduced, I'm Mama Budi Kubjani. I'm based at the Health Economics and Epidemiology Research Office, which is based at the WITS Health Consortium at WITS, just to correct Rizani. Yeah, so the rationale of the talk, the purpose of my talk today is to give a rationale for using mathematical modeling for future use of TB, for introductions of new TB vaccines. I'll just start with giving a background on TB, just to highlight how much it's still a public health challenge and one of the leading causes of deaths globally from infectious disease. Globally, we had about 10 million new people falling ill with TB, and about 1.2 million dying from TB. And globally, the leading regions with TB are in the Asian regions and in Africa. In Africa, we have about 24% of the global burden contributed by Africa itself. And some of the countries that are leading in Africa are Nigeria, DRC, and in the Southern Africa, having South Africa as the leading contributor. And HIV is the main driver of TB, followed by undernutrition in the region. I'm just going to take us back on the history of TB and control strategies, which will lead us to why we coming to vaccines. But the 1990s, 1980s, global TB trends were declining, and until the early 90s when HIV resurged, especially in Africa. And this figure on the left shows the trends in TB in cities in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere in red, being Cape Town. And during this pre-1980s period, most of the global strategies were, or most of the strategies at the time were included the discovery of BCG about 100 years ago, which is still the only TB vaccine that we're currently using. And some of the drugs, although now we're still using them currently, but have reduced in terms of burden, in terms of the pill burden. And from the 1990s, we've had the directly observed treatment strategy, which focused on finding TB cases and treating them effectively. And this was updated from the 2000s to 2015 by the Stop TB and the Millennium Development Goals, which address the emergence of HIV and increasing HIV-associated TB, and also accounting for drug-resistant TB. And currently we are in the NTB strategy and the Sustainable Development Goals, where we're aiming to eliminate TB, moving from control to elimination. And this involves some of the efforts have involved in advancing research and diagnostics, new regimen, and more efforts into discovering an effective TB vaccine. And the goals of the NTB targets are to reduce TB deaths by 95% and to reduce incidence by 90% by the year 2035 relative to 2015 levels, and also to ensure that no household is experiencing TB-related costs that exceeds 20% of their households, which household income, which is what is classified as TB catastrophic costs. And on the figure on the right, it's showing a mathematical modeling exercise that was conducted at the time when this strategy was put in place. In the red, it's the trajectory of TB incidence rate globally if we continued with no new developments in controlling TB. And in the blue, it's the hypothetical scenario where we would introduce newer tools, optimize current tools, and introduce new vaccines that are effective in order to meet the NTB or elimination targets as shown in the blue line. So in terms of the TB vaccine pipeline, I'm showing this figure shows the roadmap for research and development and where mathematical modeling will start to play a role. And I'm glad Sheetal started the talk with giving more background on the use of mathematical modeling. But with respect to TB vaccine and development from trial stages to implementation, in this stage where we are closing towards finalized, well, most of the trials being in phase 3, upon having those results, that's when we can start having mathematical models aid us in understanding the impacts or the future impacts at a population level. And obviously this also involves other key enabling individuals such as the funders and the stakeholders, including such groups as immunization groups and also advisory groups and also national ministries of TB and health in general. And just to give us a picture of where we're at with the vaccine pipeline for TB currently, or as of September 2024, there were about 12 candidate vaccines are in trial stages and about 6 in phase 3, and about 3 of them are prevention of disease, and about 3 are also prevention of infection, targeting various population groups from infants, elderly, adolescents, and HIV-infected individuals, which is very important in settings in the Southern Africa, especially. Tito has already talked about modeling and how important it is and what makes it useful. And I'll just give an overview of a TB model and how we've made it a more South African specific or country specific. And some of the key details or data that makes it useful to a specific country include the demographic, which have been touched earlier as well. But the demographic structures and the epidemiological data, and also the most prevalent comorbidities that are driving the TB or the disease of interest. And also what is important is what you would eventually use to fit or to make sure that your model is representative of that population. We refer that as the calibration data. So this could be your notification data, your mortality data from the VATO registers, TB prevalence surveys, and also microbiological tests. And the quality of these data will also determine how useful your model would be eventually. And also to be able to give input into the model according to what the healthcare system is, and also the care cascade and how people flow through the healthcare systems. And so some of the key uses in terms of vaccine modeling, TB vaccine modeling, how the mathematical models could be useful. It is, for instance, looking at the target populations that would be prioritized to achieve the most impact. So these are some of the questions that would be engaged between the advisory panels and experts in the field, the immunization groups, in terms of which groups to prioritize. Is it adults, infants, the elderly, or HIV positive, or the entire population all at once? And also the implementation strategies that should be implemented and could be implemented in the model for reasonable predictions. Is it how often should the vaccine be implemented? Is it once off or every other 5 years? And what proportion of the target population should be given the vaccine? And how will the TB vaccine program be integrated in the entire health system, especially for where mostly TB program already exists, and we would be introducing a new tool. So how will that fit with the existing interventions or the system in general? And using the model, we can then also project the impact it would have at a population level, with our key outcomes mostly being incidence and mortality averted. but other outcomes could be quantified or decided on. And also very useful would be the determining the cost of implementing such an intervention, so that we can inform the government or the national TB programs on how much they should prepare to spend or invest in. And also in terms of cost, we can conduct investment cases where we consider all the entire TB interventions in the system and determine the best combination that leads to the most impact impact in terms of reducing mortality and incidence while saving costs. More recently, we've had a number of TB modeling studies that have been focusing on TB vaccines, and a lot of them have focused on countries such as China and South Africa, and there have been also country level and sub-regional focused studies. And some of the insights we get from these is generally that a new vaccine would be effective and cost effective if implemented. A vaccine that is effective as about 50% could lead to reducing TB incidence and mortality substantially. And now as we are in the phase of phase 3 trials, the preparation that is required from countries and the region is to prepare for implementation of these such a vaccine, and how the conversation that is required is to see how an optimal implementation would look like, and in order to meet greater impact. And some of the other qualitative studies that are required include things like feasibility and also acceptability of the vaccine itself, because it's not guaranteed that once we have a effective vaccine, it will immediately be taken up by everyone. So those are some of the key issues that need to be addressed before we get to that stage. And so in this last few slides, I'll just give an example of how we've used mathematical modeling at a national level to inform the national TB program. Although this has not included vaccines, but it has proven as a useful process that we have used in South Africa to engage with the national stakeholders and also as researchers to determine the impact and costs of interventions in the program and advise on budgeting for the next few years. So this starts with a TB model that, as I showed earlier, it's like a whole body of work which was done before. It's not, as Sheetal also said, it takes a long time to develop such a model, but if it's developed already and is fit to address policy questions, then in the time like this, when we need to add a new intervention, then such exercises could be held. So with this transmission model, we include the target populations that would need to be targeted for the specific interventions. And over time, we can also model the impacts of those various interventions and the target populations and the impact being incidence or mortality. But in this stage, we also engage with the stakeholders, and we in immunization groups can also fit in here, where they would tell us for instance, how to implement the program, or to which population groups to target, and also the coverage levels of the intervention if to make it more feasible, because it's not just an academic exercise. And separately, there needs to be a work that describes the costs of each of the interventions. And based on what we've done at the work that has been done at HERO, there is a comprehensive repository of TB program costs that we integrate in this analysis. So including the costs and the target populations, we can calculate the total costs of implementing that particular intervention. And then we can then calculate the cost effectiveness, which is essentially the relative cost of that additional intervention with the outcomes of interest. So it could be the cost per the TB cases averted, or life years saved, or mortality averted. And using this for all the interventions that are in the program, for instance, we have all the testing, treatment, and prevention, and we could also include vaccines once it is ready. To see using the model, we're able to project the impact it would have over a certain period, and also see how well we would be doing in terms of meeting the targets. And as you can see with what we have, we are very far from reaching the 2030 or 2035 targets with the current interventions. And we can also estimate the total budget of for over the period that the government or the National TB Program is requiring us to estimate. And similarly, with a new vaccine, we could also do the same and tell them what would be the additional cost of that and its impact, and how it would compare in terms relative to the other interventions that are in the program. Okay. Yeah, so that is and I'll just summarize with that indeed mathematical modeling is a valuable tool for informing decision making, and in this case for vaccine planning, for TB vaccine planning, it's a necessary tool. Collaborations between policymakers, other stakeholders, and NITAGs is essential at development or inception of studies and analyses, such as modeling TB vaccines, and just before implementation. And it is important to adapt models to local contexts for them to be more informative and useful for a specific context. And it is important to have data that is of quality, because what you input really does affect your results essentially. And it is very important to have local capacity in terms of modeling or conducting the modeling work, and also just understanding the or engaging with modeling. And Sheetal has just covered that. So it could be sufficient for someone to just be able to engage with a modeling work and have critical questions and critique where they think it would be a good model or not. Yeah, and this is the end of my talk. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mama Pudi, for presenting to us on the work on modeling with respect to preparing the countries for the introduction of new TB vaccines. We've come to the end. We're 6 minutes past the hour. So first, just to say thank you so much. Please complete the poll. I think to Sheetal and Mama Pudu, the last speakers, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So there are some questions that are on Q&A. And I've typed on the chat that should people have a question regarding this webinar, could be questions on what Shito has presented or Mama Pudi, please email us on niche@uct.ac.za, or you can even reach us through our help desk, which I've typed the link on the chat. So I think the purpose for this webinar was to expose NITAGs and other stakeholders in the immunization field on give them some insight on the utility of modeling to advance vaccines and immunization practices. And I think there is a lot that can be done. You've seen that with old vaccines like rubella, still modeling has made some huge input in terms of changing the policy and making the countries that were not potentially eligible to introduce the vaccines, introduce rubella vaccines. And also looking at the future, Mama Pudi has talked about future TB vaccines. So I think there is much more that model-based evidence can be utilized to advance our immunization practices. And this was the purpose of the webinar. And if you want us to carry on with another webinar on modeling, we're very happy to do that. Just to mention to you that when we asked NITAGs 5 years ago what kind of support they would need from a NITAG support hub, one of the things that came up strongly was support in modeling. And we've partnered with Shito and others who can work with you as NITAGs in giving you technical support to enable you optimally use model-based evidence for your decision making. Quickly to thank you, the participant, for joining us. We really appreciate. Thank you very much for your patience, time, and also your questions. And also thanking the speakers. Balsha, you heard about the need for switching from 10-dose to 5-dose measles-containing vaccine vials as a part of the effort to advance rubella elimination goal. Matthew presented on rubella, and Amy and also the team from VMC, Shito and Mama Pudi. Thank you so much to all the speakers and also to the chairs, Ijeoma, Rutani, and others. And then finally to also thank you the niche team, especially Alana and Salim, for all the heavy lifting and behind the scene work for organizing this. And just to mention to you all that slides will be shared on the niche website, including the recording. And also we will liaise with GNN to have this recording updated on the NITAG Resource Center through GNN. And we will be in touch. Please complete the polls in terms of the next topics that you'd want us to cover for the next webinar. And also tell us how we can support you in terms of modeling work. So thank you, everybody, and wishing you a very good day and the rest of the week. Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.